Today's shiur is Kesubos Daf Gimel. We begin today's shiur 11 lines from the top of Daf Gimel. You'll notice there's a squiggle underlined expression, Iko Diamri. In effect, we're continuing where we left off in our previous shiur that dealt with the question or the issue of yesh or ein oines begitin. And this was coming off the previous topic where we saw that when a situation of onus, something beyond a person's control, arose, in the context of Kesubos, in the context of a husband's obligation to provide sustenance for his wife, if, without getting into all of the details of our previous shiur, we of course are hopeful that everyone learned the previous shiur, but we saw there that if the year mark arose and he was unable, because of circumstances beyond his control, to start supporting her, he was not obligated to start supporting her until the first opportune time arose. That was a function of oines, and regarding the support of the wife, so the onus was a factor that we took into consideration. In the previous year, we saw, with regard to Gittin, the first of two opposite approaches, where we numbered them off number one, and today we're beginning with approach number two, where we saw in the previous discussion, the approach was where the Gemara said, Avoliini Gittin Eino Kain, where with regard to Gittin, to issues of divorce, where a stipulation is made and circumstances beyond one's control prevent him from fulfilling those stipulations. With regard to divorces, we did not take the onus, the circumstances beyond his control into consideration. We said that the get went through anyway. Now, in today's Gemara, we begin with an opposite approach. Iko Diamri. We continue in the Gemara text. Omar Rava v'chein le'inyan gittin. Just like we saw by Kesubos, by the requirement of a husband to support his wife, if onus arose, he was not obligated to support her. The onus was taken into consideration. So too, with regard to divorce documents. Almo kosova Rava yesh oines begitin. So you can see here that Rava holds that the onus is something we take into consideration with regard to divorce documents, with regard to divorces. And of course, the marking system that we have used, you can see we introduced during our last year with the diamonds highlighting Rava, Roman numerals number 1 and 2, showing the two versions of how to approach the issue of oines with regard to Gittin. Now we continue with a marking that we feature on the side under the Nosei Mivne heading. You see an inverted house shape. These are kushios, these are questions, mimakoros v'takdimim, from sources and precedent, shebahem roim de'ein oines begitin. So these will represent a challenge to what we just claimed, that under in Rava's name, that yesh oines begitin. These sources, which by the way will appear very familiar because these are the same sources that we saw in our previous year, where we had a right side up house marking. There the Gemara was seeking a support for the idea of ein oines begitin. Here we're going to cite the same sources which suggest ein oines begitin, as we saw last time, but here they represent a challenge to Rava, who claims yesh oines begitin. So let's go over the sources, let's go through the Gemara, and as I said, this will be very familiar to those of you who learned our previous shiur. Meisvei, hareze gitech im lo bosi mikan vi'ad shnei moser chodesh. A man says to his wife, this is your divorce document if I don't show up between now and 12 months. Umeis besoch shnei moser chodesh, and the man dies within 12 months, so he's not going to be showing up anymore. And the source says, eino get. It's not, the get does not go through. In his inability to show up, as you can see, as a result of his death. And now we read on in the Gemara, meis hu deino get, ha cholo hareze get. Only in the case of his dying do we say that it's not a get, and the reason for that is because the get was going to take effect at the 12-month mark, but he was dead already before that. And we have a rule that ein get le'achar misa, a divorce document cannot take effect if the husband is dead. So she can't be considered divorced when the 12-month mark arrives, because he had died already before that. But we infer, had, let us say, he didn't show up not because of death, but because he got sick. We infer, if he didn't come because of circumstances beyond his control, namely an ailment, the get nevertheless is a good get. She is considered divorce. But he might very well have wanted to come back. He was prevented from fulfilling his condition because of circumstances of onus. And you see from here that we don't factor that in, and the get goes through. That is indicative of ein ones begitten. We don't take into consideration the ones circumstances, and the get goes through. That is a problem for Rava. Now, notice the triangle marking on the side. We have this listed as a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track of a back and forth style Gemara. With the point facing up, they represent a response, and the inverted triangle represents a question. So we respond. Li'olam eimoloch chola nami eino get. I'll tell you that as far as this source is concerned, even if he got sick, it's also not going to be a get, because yesh ones begitten, which is, of course, good for Rava. Vehi gufo kamashmon, the source that we read wasn't to be read with an inference in mind, but rather to read it at face value. Gufo means it as itself. To read it at face value. The ein get li'achar misa, simply to tell us that there is no divorce if the husband died beforehand. The point, of course, that we mentioned earlier. The Gemara asks, ein get le'achar misa, if that's what the purpose of this source was in order to accomplish that information, ha tana le reisha. The reisha, the first part of this source, tells us that information. The Gemara says, I still need the seifa, the latter part. Dilma lafuke midirabosenu. Again, following the back and forth of the Gemara, we're holding now in the position that yesh ones begitten. So as far as Rava is concerned, he's still in good shape. As far as the seeming repetitious element of the Tanaic source, in other words, we have a reisha which conveyed the idea of ein get lachar misa, and the seifa which seems to say the same thing. What's the point of the seifa, therefore? It's to exclude the opinion of Rabosenu. And this, of course, is something that we saw in our previous shiur, and the Rabosenu opinion was that we emphasize the date written in the get in order to establish its date or its time of effectiveness. And here we're coming to tell you that we don't follow that approach. Here the Gemara, though, doesn't elaborate. Tashma. So we bring another source and another challenge. What does the source say? This also deals with divorces. A man says, "Me'achshav im lo bosi mikan v'ad shnei mosar chodesh." A man says that this is your divorce if I don't come back here from now till 12 months. Umeis besof shnei mosar chodesh, and he dies within the 12 months. Harei ze get. She is considered divorced. My love, hu hadin lochola. Is it not so that the same would apply if he didn't come back because of an ailment? So whether he doesn't come back because he's dead or he doesn't come back because of an ailment, the get is still a good get. What do we see from this? We see that ein ones begitten. Now, I want to point out, though, that as far as the question of ein get la'achar misa, in his stipulation he said it's a good get if from now until 12 months. So we don't have the problem of ein get li'achar misa. Nevertheless, the Gemara's thinking is that just like if he died within the 12 months, it's a good get, so too if he took ill and didn't come back, the get goes through. Even though maybe he wanted to come back, but he couldn't because of the ones circumstances. So what do we see from here? That we don't factor in ones. Ein ones begitten. This is a challenge to Rava. Lo, the Gemara rejects that. Meis davka. It's only in the case where he died that we say that the get is a good get. Delo nichole de tipol kami yavam. The husband wanted her to be considered divorced in a circumstance where otherwise she would have become a yavama. She would have been bound to the levirate marriage of his brother. Here's a couple that right now doesn't have any children, and in the event that he dies leaving no children, she becomes a widow and then would have to marry his brother. And there was a mutual understanding that was not in their best interest. So in order to save his wife from being subjected to his brother in a yibum levirate marriage, he divorced her with this stipulation that the get shall be effective from now up till 12 months if I don't come back. And only because of the death do we say that the get is a good get, because his whole objective was to keep her away from the yavam. And of course, a yavam marriage only arises in the event of his death. So he created this stipulation, or formulated this stipulation in such a way that she would be divorced before widowhood would set in. But if, let's say, he took ill and that's the reason he didn't come back, well, she's still married to her husband. There's no issue of yibum to begin with. And in a case like that of his taking ill, so the source would not have ruled that the get is a good get, because yesh ones begitin. So far, that's a good defense for Rava's position. Tashma, another challenge. Me'ahu, di'amar lahu. Again, this is a Gemara we saw in our previous shiur. There was a man who had given a divorce document to his wife, and he said, "Ilo asino mikan ve'ad shloishim yom levegita." He says that if this is your divorce, if I don't come back from now until 30 days. So that if this husband doesn't show up within 30 days, she would be considered divorced. Also, b'sof talsin yoimin, this husband appears in the distance at the end of the 30th day, upaske mavro, but there was a river between their actual location and where the husband was on this 30th day, and he couldn't get across the river. V'omar luhu, and he screams from the other side of the river, chazu dasoi, chazu dasoi. You see, I've arrived. Now, he's really not literally arrived, because he's stuck on the other side of the river. But he's screaming out, I'm here. The Omar Shmuel, lo shmei masya. That's not considered a fulfillment of the conditions. And the get goes through. It becomes a formal divorce. Why? Well, it would seem that ein ones begin. The fact that he was caught on the other side of the river, which is a circumstance you might view as beyond his control, that doesn't interest us. The taina, the claim of beyond my control, doesn't figure in. Ein ones begitin. This is a problem then for Rava, Roman numeral number 2. The Gemara responds, this is not a problem. Here, the person was negligent in his stipulation. Oinso de shchiach shaini, a common circumstance that appears to be beyond one's control, that's different. Where you know, or where you should have expected something like this to happen, is different. The kevan di boy leilasniye velo asni, since he should have stipulated. He should have said, listen, that if I'm stuck on the other side of the river, let's that also be considered my having arrived. But he didn't say that. Iyu hu da'afsid anafshi, he caused his own loss, but an unexpected, unanticipated type ones, that is something that would prevent the divorce from going through. So at this point, the Gemara would be concluding that yesh ones begitin, and with that we can support Rava. As you can see, we have a slash mark indicating that which follows is a new trend of thought. On the side of the Gemara, we have a nosei mivne heading, a trapezoid form appears, and we've written Beis Shlovim, there are two stages, B'yitziras, in the formulation of Dino Shel Shmuel, Reb Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, the Im Yesh Matzav Shebeis Din Yoshvin Kol Yom, if there would arise a situation where Bezdin sits in session, where the court sits in session every day, Isha Nises Kol Yom, then we could allow marriages to take place on any given day. Just to recall, the Mishnah spoke about a girl marrying, if she's a basula, she marries on Mondays and Thursdays, I should say days that the court is. Let's actually to be. I said Thursdays. That's not accurate. Rather, the Mishnah mentioned Wednesdays. I mentioned Monday, but that's a point the Mishnah mentioned as days that the court sits in session. The Mishnah focused specifically on Wednesday. That would be a day for a woman to get married, because if the husband should discover that she is not a basula, a virgin, as he thought she was, then he would run immediately to the Beis Din with his claim that she presents a problem, without going through all the details that we discussed in our previous shiur. So the insistence on the Mishnah of a marriage on Wednesday was because the next day the court sat in session, affording him with an opportunity of immediately presenting his case or his problem to the court. If the courts would sit in session every day, so then there should be no reason not to allow marriages on any given day. So now the Gemara. Amar of Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, Lo Yishanu, the ruling of the Mishnah that a basula's nises, she gets married only on Wednesdays, is Elo mitakonas Ezra v'elech. That's from the time that Ezra established the rule of court sessions on Mondays and Thursdays. She'ein botei dinim kvuin elo b'sheni v'chamishi. Courts are not set in motion or sit in session other than on Mondays and Thursdays. Avol kodim takonas Ezra, but earlier, historically speaking, before Ezra, shebote dinin kvuin b'chol yom, where courts were in session every day. Isha nises b'chol yom, a woman could get married on any day, because on any day that she gets married, if the husband discovers that she is not a basula, he would run to the court with his claim, and as we saw in our previous year, that would create a sort of a public noise. And if witnesses knew that she had been with another man after this couple's kiddushin, so they would then be able to prosecute. And we didn't want, as we saw in our previous year, we didn't want any cooling off period, so we wanted to have their initial intimacy in immediate proximity of the day in which the court is in session. But if the court is in session every day, as it was historically before Ezra established what he did, so marriages could take place on any day. The Gemara asks, Kodem takonas Ezra, mai dahavi have. Whatever took place before Ezra established the rule of court sessions on Mondays and Thursdays, whatever was. The Gemara and the Mishnayos are not interested in teaching us a lesson in history. Whatever was. What's Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's point? Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is coming to qualify the Mishnah's teaching. Is his point to tell us that the Mishnah represents a time period after Ezra, but prior to Ezra, then it would have been different? But who cares? That's an interesting topic for historians, but we're not studying history right now. We're dealing with halacha. So the Gemara responds that we didn't understand Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak in a proper way. Rather, hachi komar. Here we have a second volcano shape, indicating there's a second stage of developing Rav Shmuel's point. What Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak is trying to tell us is as follows: if there would be a situation or a society or a community where Batei Dinim, where courts sit in session every day, like it was before Ezra established his rule of Mondays and Thursdays, then Isha Nises B'chol Yom, then a woman could in fact get married any day of the week. The Gemara asks, how can you say that a woman could get married any day of the week? Ha bo'inon shoktu. Now this is a term that we made reference to back on Daf Beis on our previous shiur. Shoktu is a term referring to the sages had placed their mind to establish, to make sure that a person would invest 3 days in the preparation of the wedding meal. So that if a person is going to invest 3 days in preparation of a wedding meal, so Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday are days that the husband is preparing the meal. He can't get married. He can't consummate the marriage during that time. He's busy with the meal. So, and we're interested that a person prepares a proper wedding feast, and that we assume will require 3 days of preparation. So how can you say that, well, they can get married any day? The Gemara says both points are true. We'll give you now a situation where they could get married on any day. The tariach lei. If there is, imagine today, it's very easy for us to imagine we have prepared food that could be put in a freezer. Just you slip it out of the freezer whenever you need it. Rashi says, the second line from the bottom, the tariach lei im torach lifnei haShabbos, if he troubled himself before Shabbos, the tiken tzorchi suda, and he made all the festive preparations ahead of time, then he could marry her on Sunday or on Monday, because the court is in session the next day. The Gemara continues at the top of Omid Beis, my shoktu. The Gemara here is asking, what is the Tanaic source in which we find this concept of shoktu alluded to? It is true that we made reference to shoktu before, but that was in the name of Shmuel, Rashi points out at the top. But we're, in all due respect to Shmuel was an Amora. We're interested in finding a Tanaic source for this concept, thereby giving it the strength of, or the basis from which we can ask questions. So, what is the Tanaic reference to shoktu? Tisanya. Note that we have a long answer marking. The Gemara itself contains a long Tanaic source, but what we need for our immediate purposes doesn't consume the whole source, but rather as the long answer mark indicates. So after the long answer finishes, the source itself continues with additional points that the Gemara will focus on after the conclusion of the source. So we now continue on the top line. Disanya, Bipnei ma omru basula nises liyom haravi'i. Why was it established that virgin marriages, consummation of marriages, nisuin is the consummation of the marriage, that it is to take place on a Wednesday? She'im hoyolo tainas besulim, if the husband should have any claim concerning her not being a virgin, hoyo mashkim lebezdin, he would then the next day get up and go with his claim to the court. And as we alluded to earlier in today's year, but we saw this in a more elaborate fashion in our previous year, the fear is that he finds her to be a non-basula, that is that arises a possibility, that raises a possibility that she had been in intimacy with another man after their kedushin took place, and if that would be the case, she would be prohibited to her formal husband. The Gemara continues, V'tinose be'echod b'Shabbos v'im hoya lo tainas b'sulam hoya mashkim lebezdin. Let a marriage take place, a consummation of the marriage take place on a Sunday, and if he has this claim that she's not a virgin, he would have the chance to get up the next morning on Monday to the court. And we know that Ezra established the courts sit in session on Mondays and Thursdays. So that just like you said, the consummation of marriage can take place on Wednesday, let Sunday also be an option, being that Monday is the following day, a day in which the court sits in session. So the Gemara explains why the Sunday marriage consummation is not followed. Shoktu chachamim al takonos b'nai Yisrael. The chachamim applied themselves for the benefit of the daughters of the people of Israel. Shehei adam tarech b'suda shlosh yomim. We want their marriage to take place in the context of a festive, rich meal, and we want the husband to invest 3 days of preparation. Echad b'Shabbos, v'sheni b'Shabbos, v'shlishi b'Shabbos. Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. U'borvi konsa. And on Wednesday he then would consummate the marriage. And if there's any problem, Thursday is a day in which the courts sit in session. So that is appreciation of the issue of shoktu. U'misakona v'elech nohagu ha'om lichnois b'shlishi. From the time of danger onwards, the public practiced developed the custom of marriage consummation on Tuesdays. And the Chachamim did not protest. You're dealing here with a public practice and the lack of opposition on the part of the rabbis. Ubesheni lo yichnos. Marriages should not take place on Monday. V'imach masoinis muter. If there are circumstances beyond their control, and Rashi points out before and over here, all of this will be explained later in the Gemara. So if there's an ones, then muter. Umafrishin es hachosin min akala leilei Shabbos tchila mipnei shu oiseh chabura. There's a very we'll say vague expression that, of course, the Gemara will develop later on. But the translation is that we separate the bride from the groom on Friday nights if they haven't consummated their marriage. If that's going to be their first act of intimacy, we don't want them doing that on Friday night. Mipnei shoseh chabura means because that creates an injury or a blood flow by the man's intimate penetration of the woman, dealing of course with a basula. There is a blood flow as a result of her first act of intimacy, and we don't want that to take place on Shabbos. Before we go further in the Gemara, you notice on the side the Mivneh heading, a bow tie is featured. Havlotas, we're going to highlight the terms sakona and later the word oines. These were points mentioned in the source. The double underline that you see used are shlavim, are stages levarer, to establish mahu sakona. So under the bow-tied sakona, you see a double underline marking. We're going to go through explaining what that is through stages. And later, when we get to the oines bow tie, also you see it's analyzed in stages. So the Gemara, my sakona. In the source, we saw a little arrow on the side also will help you find where you saw that in the source. It was also underlined that from sakona onwards, the custom developed to consummate marriages on Tuesdays. What is sakona? Ilemo di amri besula hanises liyoim horavi tehareg. If there was a proclamation made by the Gentile authorities that declared that any virgin who gets married on a Wednesday shall be put to death. So, nohagu, legamri neakre. Why does the source say that a custom developed? It should be totally uprooted. In other words, marriages on Wednesdays should be totally uprooted. Why does the source indicate that they simply developed a custom? If it's a life-threatening situation, you don't need to develop a custom, but rather a formal ruling undoing Wednesday as the day for marriage consummation because it presented a threat of death. Omar Rabba, the Amri, the explanation of Sakon is that they said the following. not that a woman who gets married on Wednesday will be put to death, but rather, besula hanises limervi, any girl that consummates the marriage. And again, we mentioned this at length in our previous show. We're dealing with the consummation stage of a marriage. We're dealing with women that are already married, al pidin. Halachically speaking, she received money or money value from the husband, maybe up till almost a year prior to this, making her an Eishes Ish. So it's important to note that you're dealing with a woman that basically is considered halachically a married woman. And now the Gentile authorities announced that women who consummate their marriage on Wednesdays, Tiboil lehegmon tchila, shall have intimacy with the military ruler. The hegmon is a governmental authority before. In other words, he gets first crack. After he has intimacy, then she's given over to the husband. Well, of course, that's a very undesirable situation, and that was presented an element of sakana, and therefore they practiced the Tuesday consummation of marriages. The Gemara asks, "Hi, sakana oinesu? You're calling this a threat of danger? This is ones. Ones is something beyond their control, and as such, a woman that is basically raped. We'll call this an elegant form of rape, because the woman is going to be subjected beyond her control to this intimacy with the hegmon, and therefore there's nothing prohibitive about the woman, even if she does have the intimacy with the hegmon on that Wednesday. She still is allowed to her husband. So the Gemara is asking, why do we have to undo the practice of consummation of marriages on Wednesdays? The hegmon does not present, maybe you'll say it's an unpleasant situation, but it doesn't present itself as a halachic problem per se. So it's oinus, it's beyond her control, nothing you can do about it. Let the original halacha stay in place. And why do you Bichlal describe this as a sakona, as an element of danger? Where's there a life-threatening element here? The Gemara answers, and we should have introduced the triangles that you see on the side. This is a ma'akav, an attempt to keep track of a back and forth style of Gemara, where the point facing up is a question, the inverted triangle is a response. So the Gemara answers, Mishum di'iko tsnuos, de mosra nafshayel lekaplo ve'asyon lidei sakona. There are Jewish women that lead a very modest lifestyle, and they will give up their lives rather than be involved with intimacy with this hegmon, this governmental official. So the element of sakona is still present, and that's why the source referred to this as a sakona. The Gemara asks, "V'lidrosh lehu da'oines shari." Why couldn't the rabbis of the time tell these women that if it's ones, it's mutter? In other words, you are still allowed to your husbands. Don't give up your life for this. Allow yourselves to be subjected to this dishonor. However, it doesn't prevent you from being with your husbands. There's no reason to give up your life for it. So why don't the rabbis just teach that and keep the law in its place, the consummation of marriages on Wednesdays? Iko, the Gemara answers, Iko prutzos v'iko nami kohanais. The necessity in the eyes of the public of moving a day back the consummation of marriages is because you have in the society prutzos, that meaning that if you teach that ones is allowed, meaning that of course doesn't mean the act of rape is allowed, but that a woman who is raped is allowed to her husband, we're afraid that the prutzos, there are women that are loose in their own lifestyles, and if we're makil, they will go ahead and do this even willingly, claiming that it's ones, and those kind of women will in fact be prohibited to their husbands. So we can't follow this recipe or this suggestion of simply telling and teaching that ones is an ones victim is mutter to her husbands. You have to consider the prutzos, these luid type women, and the iko nami kohanos. They're also the wives of kohanim. The halacha says that a wife of a kohen who is raped, she in fact becomes Ozer to her husband. So that's simply to go on a public lecture tour that ones does not thwart or prevent a woman from being with her husband. That's not always the case, as is the situation with the kohanos. And it's with regard to the kohanos that we are afraid they might in fact risk their lives in other words, they would say, I'd rather die, kill me, than be with the hegmon, because if she is with the hegmon, in fact she becomes Ozer to her husband, and she would not be able to bear living with that. The Gemara asks, well, now after having made the case for moving the date back by a day, why not just undo the law of basulos, marrying on Wednesdays? Look at all the problems that this poses, with this hegmon appearance poses. So lakre means uproot the din altogether. Why does the source say it was a custom that developed and the rabbis didn't object? The rabbis maybe should have taken the initiative of uprooting the law of a Wednesday nisuin. The Gemara answers, Gezerah avido de batla. The rulings of the goyim, the rulings of the Gentiles, unfortunately the Jewish people are all too familiar with this as part of their history, that it goes like the waves of the sea. There are gezeros, periods where rulings, anti-Jewish rulings are put into motion, and they disappear, and they reappear, and they disappear. Therefore, they're described by the Gemara as avido de batla. It's inevitable that they will eventually go away. Batla become void. The takanta de rabbanon mekami gzera lo akrinon. A formal rabbinic ruling in the face of the passing gezeros of the Gentiles, so formal rabbinic rulings are not to be undone. There's a lot of philosophical value in that concept. We'll call it the permanence of Torah versus the passing element of Gentile oppression. Well, ihachi b'shlishi nami osi uboyel. If there's an issue of the hegmon showing up, and as a result the public practiced Tuesday weddings, how does that help? Couldn't he show up also on Tuesday? The Gemara says, "Misfeiko lo okar nafshe," as out of doubt, since, as we just got finished explaining, the rabbis didn't formally uproot the Wednesday marriage. So they didn't formally replace the Wednesday with a Tuesday marriage. So it wasn't a takonas beis din, this Tuesday marriage. The goyim, these Gentile oppressors, they relate only to formal court rulings. They don't relate to common public practice. So the hegmon isn't going to trouble himself to show up on Tuesday as a result of the Jewish community practicing Tuesday marriages. So out of Sfeika, as we said, in his mind, the the possibility, the doubt that she might get married a day earlier isn't enough to motivate him to travel from wherever he is encamped to the Jewish community. We continue with a quote from the source. The arrow should help you find where the original quote comes from. Ubesheni lo yichnos. On Mondays, marriages should not be consummated. V'machmas ha'oines mutter. If there is an ones circumstance that arises, then a Monday marriage is allowed. My oines. What do you mean by ones? Ilema ha damoran. If it's a reference to the hegmon, as we stated earlier, that's unlikely. Hasam kori le sakona, vacha kori le oines. Before, we referred to the hegmon as a sakona, something that was presented a danger, and now you're calling it ones. Vesu, and furthermore, hasam nohagu hachamuter. Before, we said that it was a public custom to push the marriage date earlier, and here you do use a different expression. You don't say noag, you say muter, that it's simply allowed. Why the change if it's the same circumstance? So you should use the same expression. Omar Rava. So Rava explains. Now you see that we have a numbering scheme. There are two approaches to explaining this case of ones. The Amri Sar Tzava Balair. They announce that the general is coming to town, and Rashi adds V'yachtafu tzor chisuda me'asher yimtzeu, and he will steal all the meals, any food that he can get his hands on, he will steal. Heichidami. What are the circumstances behind this? If he comes and goes, Rashi says, he comes and goes after Wednesday. So if that's the case, le'akev. So why don't they wait till next Wednesday to get married? Why the need to push things back? Lo tzricha. No, what is necessary here is the osi v'kova. An announcement comes that the Sar Tzava is coming to town, and he's going to be staying here for a while, so that any food he gets his hands on, he's going to take. So better to push things back. Well, if we're pushing things back, the Gimel Miyalichnos, why not then get married on Tuesday? Why is the marriage consummation pushed back to Monday, as the Gemara indicated? What's wrong with Tuesday? The Gemara answers, Asparva didei begimel kasu. His advance men come on a day on Tuesday. So the Sar Tzava, he comes around on Wednesday. The advance men come around on Tuesday, and all food that might be around they confiscate for their own purposes. Therefore, that leaves us only with Monday available for the marriage. That is the first approach to explain what the source meant, that if, as a result of an ones, so then Monday becomes mutter. The ones being the appearance of these military officials who will confiscate all prepared food. So, another approach, a totally different approach. My machmas ha'oines. What's the oines referred to that cause us to speak about marriages on Monday? Kidisanya, as is featured in the following source. We will see a case of a groom. The man's father, the groom's father, dies. We'll see where the bride's mother dies. And on the side of the Gemara, we have a Nosea topic heading, Dinei mishte v'avelus hamiyuchodim l'mikra shemes av hachosen o'em hakala. You see laws regarding wedding festivities on the one hand, and laws of mourning on the other hand, in the event that the father of the groom or mother of the bride die. So the Gemara continues. Harei shoyapito ofui utavachoi tavuach v'yenu mozug. All the food is ready. The bread is baked, the meat is slaughtered, and the wine has been mixed with water. The wine has been poured. Rashi talks about it's been mixed with water, so as to enable it to be fit for immediate drinking. Once wine is mixed with water, so its shelf life is severely curtailed, and hence it won't last. As opposed to, of course, wine that's stored in barrels for aging. So we have a situation that we just described where all the food is ready. Umeis oviv shalchosan oima shalkala, and as Rashi pointed out, that this story is taking place on a Monday, where the father of the groom died on a Monday, and it was under these circumstances that all the food was ready. What do? Machnisen es hameis l'cheder, and maybe before we even go on in the Gemara, we should glance at Rashi. 5 lines from the end of the page. Oviv shel chosano ima shel kala. Dafka nokat. The choice of these relatives is done deliberately. Oviv shel chosan shu hatorech b'tzorchei suda. That's the father of the groom that was the preparer of the meal. It might sound unusual to modern ears, where weddings are prepared by a joint sponsorship of a caterer, or other communities might have actually the bride is spending the money on preparing the wedding meal. But as far as the Gemara is concerned, it was the groom's responsibility, and more specifically the father of the groom. He was the one that prepared the meal. The mother of the bride, she was the one that prepared all the jewelry and cosmetics that were part and parcel of a bride. Lefikoch im, Rashi says, 3 lines from the bottom. Lefikoch im yavor hamoyed shuv ein mechlim. If this time goes by, there's not going to be anyone to prepare these things for them. The tirulem lachnis says hameis l'cheder. The Rashi tells us what the Gemara is about to tell us, that they allowed them to bring the body of the deceased into a side room, shaloi baru, without immediate burial, and the wedding would continue. The consummation of the marriage would take place, because if they would bury the deceased immediately, the imkain chol avelus alo avel b'stimas agolo kilo lekamon. The laws of mourning would set in immediately with the sealing of the grave. And he wouldn't be able to consummate the marriage until a week later, when the avelus passes. And then there's no one around to get the either the food or the cosmetics ready anymore. So this is called a circumstance of ones. And specifically, the source spoke about getting married, the consummation on a Monday. It's because the Av HaChosen or Ema Kala died on Monday, with everything having been prepared. So the source goes on, the deceased, the body is placed in a side room, and the bride and groom proceed to the canopy, where we say that's the nisuin. Ubayel bilas mitzvah. We're at the top of Daf Dalin Amud Aleph right now. Ubayel bilas mitzvah uporesh, and the first act of intimacy, that's called the bilas mitzvah, the first act of intimacy, and then poresh, he separates. Rashi says uporesh v'yikberu, at the top line. Rashi v'yikberu es hameis miyad, and then the body is buried. The kevan the cholol of chatuna, Havio legabe karegelin. Since the bias mitzvah took place, so it becomes the rules of festivals, regel, holidays, set upon this couple. So they are now engaged in a festival. Even though they then bury the dead, but prior to that, the law of regel set upon them. So that preempts the laws of Avelis. And therefore, Avelis does not set in. Laws of mourning don't set in immediately. V'chaylo, v'noheg shivas yemei mishta, and as the Gemara will tell us. Let's continue in the Gemara text. V'noheg shivas yemei mishta, v'achar kach noheg shivas yemei Avelis. So they first will celebrate the 7 days of festivity, and of course, I'm sure many listeners are wondering how in the world could you be festive with the death of a parent. We're presenting here halachic categories, and we're not delving into matters of emotion, as important as emotion is, but we're dealing with halachic categories. So you have 7 days in which they practice mishteh, regular meals, no overt acts of mourning, and after that week, then the 7 days of mourning. V'chol oisen hayomim, and all those days of the mishteh and the avelus, all those days. It would seem here, from as Rashi presents it, it's basically 2 weeks. Hu yoshen bein ha'anoshim v'hi yesheno bein anoshim. The groom, after they fulfilled their initial act of intimacy, they're separated. The man sleeps amongst other men, and the woman, the bride, sleeps amongst other women. In other words, they're not sleeping together as husband and wife. V'ein moinin tachshitin min hakala kol shloshim yom. And we do not withhold cosmetics and ornamentation from the bride for a period of 30 days. We want her to look attractive to the groom during the 30-day period. Even though you see that we're dealing with a period of time in which you also have a week of mourning. V'davka oviv shel chosan o ima shel kala, specifically those relatives, father of groom, mother of bride. It's specifically under those circumstances that we said what we did above, that we put the body in the side room and they first observe the 7 days of marriage festivity. This information we saw when we read the Rashi before, because in the absence of the Oviv, Ava Chosan or Ema Kala, there is no one else to take care of the necessary preparations. Avol ibcholo, if it's the mother of the groom or the father of the bride, then we would not follow this procedure. Rather, we would push everything off. We would then first bury the dead, then the laws of Avelis would set in, and then take care of the marriage, being that the people that are in charge of the marriage preparations, by whether it's from the food aspect or the tachshitim aspect, they are still around. Before we go further, we glance at the side where we have a topic heading, the nosei. Mosai, when is it? Ube'ezen nesibos, under what circumstances? Mutu lahaktim yemei hamishteh, do we say that it is allowed to have the wedding days, the week of wedding festivities precede the avelus, biglal shenosnu mayim al gabi haboser, because of the meat being exposed to water in its cooking. That will become clear as we go through the Gemara. Omar Rafram bar Popa Omar Rav Chisda Loi Shanu Ella. This is an expression of qualification. In other words, that we celebrate the wedding days before the mourning days. This is taught Elo Shenosan Mayim Al Gabi Boser, where water was poured over the meat. A reference to we'll say the beginning of the cooking process. If they didn't add water to the meat, then it can be sold. In other words, you can sell it, and with the money, you can have a new meal prepared. In other words, the issue that we mentioned before of a total loss is not the case if water was not, if the meat wasn't subjected to the water. So Rav Chisda, he introduces this, we'll say, this new qualification. Omar Rava. Rava and Rav Papa on the next line will present two extreme cases. Rava says, Ubekrach, when it comes to a large city, Afal Pisha Nosan Mayim Al Gabi Boser Mizdabein. Even if water was added to the meat, it's Krach is a large city. There are a lot of people that are in need of food. It will be, you can sell it. And since you can sell it, you don't have a total loss. You'll have money. And with that money, you can then buy the necessary meal requirements a week later. So in a krach, even if water was added to the meat, so there would be no heter. In the case of the father of the groom dying, there would be no heter for having the wedding days precede the mourning days. Omar Rav Papa, Ubekfar, in a village, Afapi Shalono San Mayim Al Gabi Bosar, Lo Mizdabein. In a village where there's a lot of meat available and a small population, even if the water wasn't added to the meat, you would have no one interested in buying that meat. So that in a village, it would always be we call it a loss situation if we were to delay. So that Rav Chisda's qualification would not apply to a kfar, just like it wouldn't apply to a krach. V'yelo de Rav Chisda hechi mishkachas law. So under what circumstances or where would Rav Chisda's point be applicable? In other words, what was Rav Chisda's point? That a distinction is made whether water was or was not added to the meat. That distinction isn't in the krach, and that distinction is not in a kfar. Omar Rav Ashi Kigon Masa Machasya. Rav Ashi explains in a community like the town of Machasya. The Mafka Mikrach Mafka Mikfar. It's a medium-sized community. It's Mafka literally means it's taken out of the category of a krach. It's smaller than a krach, and it's Mafka Mikfar. It's also larger than a tiny village. Tanya Kavosei de Rav Chisda. And here we have a Tanaic source that supports Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda, of course, was one that introduced this qualification of the meat and water being added to the meat or not. Harei shoya pito afuya utvachoy tavoch v'yenu mazuk. A wedding meal has been prepared. The bread is baked. The meat is slaughtered, and the wine has been mixed with water. V'nosan mayim al gabi bosar. And the water was poured over the meat. Umeis oviv shel chasan o imo shel kala. And as we saw earlier, these specific relatives, one of them died. The body is put into a side room, and the bride and groom go to the marriage canopy. Uboyel bilas mitzvah uporish. And the first act of intimacy takes place, and then they separate. And then they celebrate the 7 festive days, followed by 7 days of mourning. And all during those days, man sleeps with in the presence of other men. The woman, the bride, sleeps amongst other women. They do not sleep together. Likewise, a situation where a woman becomes a nida. These points will be developed later in the Gemara, where she becomes a nida as they enter the marriage canopy. Ishto means his wife, but as we mentioned before, the chuppah is a consummation of a marriage that took place many months earlier at the kiddushin stage. So as they enter the marriage canopy, she all of a sudden becomes a nida. Who Yoshen, a nida, of course, is a menstruant woman, which is strictly forbidden in intimacy. So who Yoshen bein hanoshim, v'hi yishena bein hanoshim. They sleep then separately. V'ein moinim tachshitin min hakala kol 30 yom. The bride is not to be deprived of cosmetics for the first 30 days. Bein kach u bein kach. Whether there's an oinus or not, lo yivoil lo be'erev Shabbos lo b'motzei Shabbos. Initial intimacy shall not take place on Friday. There you have the problem of the chabura, the injury that is characteristic of a first-time act of intimacy with a basula, nor on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night or Sunday, if you will. This and many other details of this source will be discussed at length in the Gemara.